Read Smart, the Baillie Gifford Prize podcast. This podcast is generously sponsored by the Blavatnik Family Foundation. Hello and welcome to everyone joining us today on Read Smart, the official podcast for the Baillie Gifford Prize for non-fiction. We're now rapidly approaching the winner announcement on the 19th of November, and so speaking with all 6 shortlisted authors about their brilliant works. Today, we're joined by David Van Reybrouck, author of Revolusi, Indonesia and the Birth of the Modern World. Based in Brussels, he previously authored Congo, the epic history of a people, which won 20 prizes and sold over 500,000 copies. His book, Against Elections, has been translated into over 20 languages and inspired participatory democracy trials in several countries. Revolusi is already a bestseller in the Netherlands, and following its translation by David Mackay and David Colmer, the book has now been shortlisted for the Baillie Gifford Prize this year. Revolusi is a masterful account of the epic revolution that, as the book sets out, sparked global decolonisation. In August 1945, a small group declared Indonesia's independence, making it the first colonised nation to do so after World War II. The struggle saw 4 million civilians die under Japanese occupation and another 200,000 in the brutal conflict with the Dutch, British and Americans. By December 1949, the UN forced the Netherlands to cede sovereignty, ending 350 years of colonial rule. David Van Reybrouck's gripping narrative, based on extensive interviews, highlights Indonesia's pivotal role in 20th century history. For context, Van Reybrouck is currently travelling for 6 weeks on a cargo ship. He's sailing from Antwerp in his native Belgium to Norway and Aberdeen, before setting sail to Angola, Gabon and Congo. This journey is a way of conducting research for his next book, which is about climate change, the new colonisation of the global south, and how colonialism is not just a thing of the past, but very much of the present and the future too. David, thank you so much for being able to speak with us today. I know it's difficult. Somewhat unusually, you're joining us today from a cargo ship. Can you tell us a little bit more about this?
We have just arrived in the harbour of Aberdeen. I've left my native Belgium from the port of Antwerp. We sailed up north to 2 harbours in Norway, then crossed the North Sea and arrived in Aberdeen now. And after that, we'll go straight down to Central Africa with a stop in Las Palmas just to get fuel. And then we go further down to Angola, Congo, Brazzaville, Gabon, etc. And I'm undertaking this journey as a form of fieldwork for a new book I'm doing. Non-fiction writing for me involves listening, looking and traveling around. And I've written 2 big books on the history of colonialism. I've written a book on Congo, which used to be a Belgian colony, and Indonesia, Revolusi, which used to be a Dutch colony. And at a given point, I realized that dealing with historical colonialism might not be enough. There is increased attention for the implications of empire, and we look at what we should do about the way we represent it today in the forms of street names and statues and restitution and school books, and this is all very important. But if we only do this, we might miss out on the most important form of colonialism that is unfolding right in front of our eyes, which is climate change. At a given point, I've seen a map of the world that indicated, that highlighted the countries most responsible for climate change, and then the countries most vulnerable to the consequences of it. And it really felt like I was looking at a copy of a colonial map. It's those countries that had colonies in the past that are today largely responsible for global emissions. China has been added to the pack. And it's mostly countries in the tropics and in the subtropics that are suffering. So I'm undertaking this project as part of an ongoing interest in colonialism, but this time it's about colonialism of the present and of the future.
What was it about Indonesia's revolution which inspired your research and writing of this book?
Well, why not write about Indonesia? Indonesia it's such a big country. It's the fourth biggest country in the world in terms of population, after India, China, and the US. It's also geographically one of the biggest countries on Earth. It's the biggest archipelago on Earth. And if you were to project the map of Indonesia on Europe, it would start in Ireland and finish in Kazakhstan. That is the size of the country. If you would project it onto the map of the US, it would stick out in both oceans, the Atlantic and the Pacific, for about 1,000 kilometers. This is the country we're talking about, but actually we're not talking about it. That's the funny thing. It's so big, it's so populous, and it has played such an important historical role. First country to proclaim its independence only 2 days after the end of World War II. That nourished and set in motion the decolonisation movement. And so a country that has been important in the history of empire, in the history of colonialism and decolonisation, but we don't hear about it. I think it's really strange. When revolutions happen in the Northern Hemisphere, we tend to regard them as global history. The French Revolution of 1789, the Russian Revolution of 1917, all this is world history. When they happen in the South, they're seen as local history. I think that's deeply problematic. And luckily, past couple of years, we have seen that, for instance, the Haitian Revolution from 1804 has increasingly been seen as a world historical event. But the Indonesian Revolution of 1945 has still been largely overlooked. And so what I tried to do with my book Revolusi was basically doing what the subtitle said. It's Indonesia and the birth of the modern world.
How do you think that Indonesia's revolution influenced other decolonisation movements around the world?
The Indonesians were the very first to proclaim their independence 2 days after the Japanese capitulation, August 17, 1945. And at that time, things were already moving in a number of countries, particularly in India, which tried to get away from British Empire, also in the Philippines, which were an American colony back then. Yes, America, the former colony, became a colonizer at a given point. So things were happening in parallel. Almost coincidentally, Indonesia was the first to proclaim the independence, but it was followed by a war that lasted 4.5 years, a war against the Dutch, who were supported by the British as well. I interviewed British soldiers, Nepalese Gurkhas who had been part of the British troops, on how they, as young Asians, had to fight young Asians in Indonesia on behalf of the British who worked on behalf of the Dutch. But this war of independence more or less created the template of what it meant to decolonize. In the 1940s, it was clear that the age of colonialism was getting over. But how do you end a colony was a matter of debate. Should it be gradual in time? Should it be partial in space? Should it involve particular powers? And what the Indonesian revolutionaries made clear is that it had to involve the entire territory of the colony, it had to involve all political powers, and it had to happen at once. Not a gradual process, not a stretched out process over more than a decade or more than 30 years, as some people even thought. It should be fast, it should be total, it should be integral in terms of political power. Surprisingly, so this became the template that was followed in all these ensuing examples, especially in Africa, which had 18 new countries in the year 1960 alone. And in 1955, just before that, Sukarno, the Indonesian president, organized the Bandung Conference, which was really set up as the first global conference without the West, so that other countries could learn from the Indonesian experience. The template that was formed there was really disseminated and distributed to fellow revolutionaries and fellow freedom fighters in other colonies. So that was really interesting. But surprisingly, what you see is that this model was repeated, and it inspired movements in Africa, in the Arab world, in Northern Africa, other parts of Asia as well. But surprisingly, the economic power was left out of that equation. So it was about a rapid transfer of all political powers over all of the territory in a quick fashion. But in many cases, like in Indonesia, big companies that belonged to colonial entrepreneurs remained in these hands. And this is what I discovered when studying Congo, for instance. Political power was handed over at the day of independence in Congo in 1960, but the economy firmly remained in the hands of the colonizers. And I think that was part of the deal somehow. European powers said, like, okay, you want to get your independence? It's a bit early. You're not talking that much about the economy. Fine, you get your political independence as long as we continue to have unlimited access to your economic resources. So that part is also forms this Indonesian template that spread across the world.
Now, in Revolusi, how did you approach the extensive research required for the book, especially the oral histories?
Yeah, I realized that if you write about colonial history in a country of the world, in a part of the world where rates of literacy are not always that high, it's dangerous if you only rely on archival sources. Because archives are always telling about those who made the archive, and colonial archives are very often archives from the colonizers. So there's not that many ordinary Indonesian voices there. The only chance for an Indonesian person to end up as an archive is when he became a criminal or at least a suspect. Then you will find his first-person account. And so for me, it was really important to be quick, to go there and interview as many people as possible on a variety of perspectives. And I traveled around. I really had to hurry. I was meeting people in their 90s. At a given point, I realized if I was going to continue in this way, that I would never get as old as the witnesses were that I was interviewing. And I started with homes for the elderly in Jakarta. You arrive there after 2 hours in a traffic jam on the back of a motorbike, and you say, like, well, are there any elderly people here? There's good chances you find some in a home for the elderly. And that was good for general orientation, but even a home for the elderly reaches only a particular subsegment of the overall population. People who live in a city, who are middle class, who are not being taken care of by families. So it was still quite selective. So I traveled around. I asked around. I asked imams and other religious leaders. I asked journalists. I asked people on the street. I asked for veterans, etc. And, you know, sometimes you ask dozens of people, hundreds of people. But I was looking for a way to increase my chances. And I noticed that people were very, very keen on social media in Indonesia, especially Facebook was at its peak then. And I joined quite a number of Indonesian Facebook groups for people interested in Indonesian history, really the history buffs. But then I realized there was perhaps another way, and I started using Tinder at the given point, which also turned out to be very popular. And I had a profile picture and a text saying that I was a Belgian writer preparing a book on the history of Indonesia and its war of independence, and basically that I was more interested in their grandmothers and grandfathers than themselves. And to make this a successful methodological strategy, I decided to become the most democratic user in the history of Tinder. I accepted literally everyone. Young, old, male, female, trans, straight, gay, whatever. Everybody was fine. At a given point, I had hundreds of matches. I think I got some notoriety in the virtual gay scene of Jakarta as well. I realized it was a good tool, but I also realized that not everybody was reading the text of my profile. And so I had to explain that I was looking for witnesses. And actually, in the book now, there are indeed a number of voices that I wouldn't have found were it not for this rather atypical procedure. But it has worked.
The book covers a vast historical period from the early days of Dutch colonization to post-independence Indonesia. How did you manage to weave those different eras into this narrative?
Although I was using a lot of social media and even dating apps when I was in Indonesia, once I was back home, I retreated into my writing atelier, I call it. It's my workspace, which is in an old factory in Brussels, and which has one incredible feature. It has no internet. And it sounds crazy, but it's such a gift to go back to a state of mind that has become so rare these days, which we used to call concentration and focus. And I went through my notes, and I had a fairly substantial library with, I don't know, hundreds, more than 1,000 books on Indonesian history. And that really was the place where I started to weave this tapestry of oral histories, impressions, reportage, together with my notes from archival research, from documents I had been consulting before in the Netherlands, with the textual documentation I had at hand. And every night I would go home, and I had like a little notebook with the 10 or 20 things I had to look up on the internet. And rather than losing half a morning, in 20 or 30 minutes I had what I was looking for. So being offline was essential to create this sort of mosaic. And what also helped, it's fairly traditional, artisanal almost. I stuck together three pieces of paper and made like a bit of a wallpaper, and then with a pencil and a very sharp tip, I was writing names of witnesses on a timeline, and who said what that was relevant for which period, and who was good for talking about the arrival of the Japanese. Who had seen massacres being taken place against communists in 1948, who had a very good story on what he thought about Dutch education in the 1930s. So building this sketch, this outline was essential in terms of creating this book.
You mentioned the concept of colonial schadenfreude in the book. I wondered if you could elaborate on this idea and how it manifests in the post-colonial relationship between Indonesia and the Netherlands.
I think all European countries are trying to come to grips with its dark colonial past, and it's been brushed under the carpet for too long, and now it comes out in the limelight again. And I think it's important. I really think we are going through an essential phase of coming to terms with what has happened in the colonies. And as our societies have become more diverse, it is normal and essential that the way we talk about the past and that the narrative about the recent past becomes much more diverse as well, if only to do justice to a myriad of perspectives. Very often colonial history has been framed as national history, and that national history has had to serve as a source of pride. And now we discovered that there is another pride that can be found, and it's not by obliterating what has happened, but by taking a sort of mature attitude to the legacy of empire. The choice is not between boasting about your colonial realizations or brushing the misdeeds under the carpet. I think it takes bravery, but also courage and there's some nobility in doing the effort of understanding what has happened, admitting that it was not all rosy, being genuinely modest and humble and very attentive to what has happened and to the voices today that are still living with that painful past and doing justice to them and giving voice to these. I think all this is essential. At the same time, colonialism is more than historical colonialism. Doing away with problematic statues and street names is an important discussion, but if we limit it to that, we're giving a total free hand to the colonizers of today, which are in the ones who are causing climate change. And so please let us not divide ourselves on the way we should deal with the colonial past, if that can serve as a smokescreen for a form of injustice that is unfolding during this age with dramatic consequences for the South and for the future.
What lessons do you believe modern nations can learn from Indonesia's journey to independence, especially in terms of handling post-colonial legacies and fostering national unity?
I think one of the greatest lessons that you can take from the Indonesian Revolusi is that you should never underestimate the young. I was writing this book at the moment that Greta Thunberg started her campaign in Sweden and then became this global massive campaign for climate justice. And there was a sort of condescending criticism that was fairly dominant, saying, oh, those teenagers, they should go back to school. They're too unschooled and unskilled, and they're not just ready yet for, have a real opinion on the real issues of our time. They should just shut up and go back to their textbooks. Don't underestimate the young. Indonesia, the fourth biggest country in the world, came about thanks to the action of people aged between 15 and 25. They were the ones who made the revolution. And I hope that the climate activists today will use less violent methods than the ones that were used by many Indonesian freedom fighters. Horrific forms of violence have been witnesses. They had been trained and stimulated by the Japanese during the World War II to learn to fight. But the fact that the young are a critical factor when it comes to the key challenges of our time, for me, is one of the key lessons.
David, thank you so much for speaking to us. That's David Van Reybrouck there and his book, Revolusi. We'd like to thank the Blavatnik Family Foundation for its continued generous support of this podcast. The winner will be announced on Tuesday, the 19th of November, at an awards ceremony generously supported by the Blavatnik Family Foundation. The announcement will also be live streamed across the Baillie Gifford Prize for non-fiction social channels. If you're interested in finding out more about the shortlisted books, you can visit our website or follow us on X, Facebook, Instagram and TikTok at BG Prize. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thanks for listening. Until next time. Read Smart, the Baillie Gifford Prize podcast. This podcast is generously sponsored by the Blavatnik Family Foundation.